you shared that wisdom with all of us and maybe found some empathic listeners up here as well. And really, to each of you, Lucy, Hazel, Yasher Koach, for offering that wisdom, for chanting so beautifully, for taking your roles as adults in this community, leading us so beautifully, and for teaching us. I'd like to spend a little more time unpacking the teachings that each of you shared, but first I just want to say thank you and mazel tov. Lucy, we're going to start with you. You did a deep dive into one verse of the Parsha, Numbers 15, verse 16, where we read, "There shall be one law for you and for the stranger who sojourns with you." And you asked, is that really fair? Shouldn't foreigners among Israelites be able to practice their religions however they want? Sifting through classical commentaries on the Parsha, you explained that Ibn Ezra and Rashi argue in favor of non-Israelites assimilating into the Israelite way of being, effectively converting. By contrast, Maimonides argues that non-Israelites are welcome to do whatever they want so long as they abide by the 7 Noahide ethical rules that you also mentioned. But ultimately, you landed with a different take, which in some ways was a rebuttal to all 3 of those medieval rabbis. You argued that welcoming the stranger means not just helping someone on your terms, but raising them up for who they are without harsh judgment. And you made that argument on the basis of another mitzvah of welcoming the ger, the stranger, noting that there is a universalistic impulse in our tradition, even as there is also a nationalistic or particularistic one. The Bible scholar Richard Elliott Friedman draws a similar connection between the ethics of loving the stranger as oneself and the idea that there should be one law for citizens and non-citizens alike. For anyone who's curious about whether Jewish ethics are directed only toward Jews or also at the broader non-Jewish collective, I highly encourage you to look up Friedman's scholarship. In short, he argues that if we look at the original intention of these laws, the notion of one law for the Israelite and the non-Israelite alike was a sort of proto-democratic departure from ancient Near Eastern tribalism. It was, he argues, an early attempt at making all people in a given society equal before the law. As we know, equal protection under the law is a staple of American democracy, and we must remain vigilant to ensure that it remains a hallmark of American life. But to your point, Lucy, Jews haven't always read that verse of Torah as a protection of equality for all people. And the question of how Jews should relate to non-Jews has bedeviled rabbis and scholars since the beginning of our tradition. Indeed, it remains one of the central questions of our time. To what degree should we prioritize ourselves as Jews, and to what degree are we ethically obligated to all of humanity? I admit that on that subject, Parshat Shlach is not an easy one for us as American Jews in 2025, attempting to hold all of this in balance, keeping our sense of peoplehood in equipoise with our humanism. The Parsha, as we've heard, focuses on the Israelites scouting the land of Israel before waging war against its inhabitants, taking for granted that conquest and war are inevitable. And these days, that's an especially painful premise for us, given the reality of Israel at war today, not only with Hamas in Gaza, but now also Iran. We'll come back to that, but next I want to focus on your teaching, Hazel. As the 12 scouts return from their journey into the land, we know 10 of them come back terrified by what they saw there, convincing almost all the rest of the Israelites that there's no chance of conquering the land. On this matter, Hazel, you pointed out that there might have been good reason to question things, especially when the leadership insisted upon going to war. And you argued in favor of taking a beat, questioning authority, and really weighing the potential risks and benefits of making a difficult decision. And then you offered another lesson from this Parsha, that perhaps the Israelites should have been more grateful for all that God had given them. This is consistent with the classical view of the sages. Our rabbis will go on to say that the grave mistake of the 10 spies was that they gave into their fear, that they were unwilling to believe that God would protect them as God had for nearly the 40 years in which they had been wandering. Rashi and others explain that the sin of the people for which they were punished with not being able to enter the promised land was that they were reactive, guided by fear, swayed by leaders who themselves were afraid and who had abandoned God. Taken together, your two teachings remind us that the Torah refuses to give us a simple moral calculus. On the one hand, we get a story focused primarily on Israelite self-interest, depicting how our people must conquer another to live out our destiny. On the other hand, we also get a set of laws designed to foster a society of justice for Israelites and non-Israelites alike once a government is established. So too, we read of the importance of having faith in authority, but we also read a tale of people falling in line behind the wrong set of leaders. The whole thing is just kind of complicated. What the Parsha lacks in easy answers, it makes up for in eternal truths. Stories that resonate year after year because they demonstrate how it's not always easy to know what to do when we're faced with a daunting challenge. We are not the first generation of Jews to see our own contradictions, anxieties, and questions reflected in the text. And this morning, I'm thinking of how resonant that was a quarter century ago when I became bar mitzvah, reading from this very same Torah portion. At the risk of betraying my youth, I'll share that when I ascended that bima in 2003, I used the story of the spies to speak in my drash about the dangers of espionage. George W. Bush had only recently signed the Patriot Act into law, and many of you here will remember the national ferment about homeland security in those years after September 11th. Questions pervaded public discourse about the constitutionality of government surveillance and about detaining immigrants without trial. All of that is familiar enough to our own time, but let's also remember that 3 months before Shabbat Shlach that year, the US invaded Iraq. Few of us today think of that war as a successful one, leading as it did to nearly a decade of protracted violence and the emergence of the Islamic State thereafter. And unsurprisingly, I was reminded of all this as I read the news this week, that after days of direct conflict between Israel and Iran, President Trump is now weighing the possibility of American involvement in this war, another eerie echo of the past. Some see this moment as a chance to finally vanquish Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps and set in place a new regime. Others see it as a precious opportunity to learn from the failures of earlier wars, using the might of American influence to de-escalate the growing conflict. And as usual, given its implications for Israel, American Jews are divided about what our country should do. Should we or shouldn't we attack Iran is a question we'll debate for, 2 weeks, he said. And without wading too far into that debate this morning, there is really only one lesson I want to draw out today from the memory of other Middle East wars, which is that the specter of war, however well-intentioned or even justifiable, can also be a distraction. It can distract us away from the flaws of our own leadership, and more important still, war can distract us from core aspects of who we are and what we believe in, the values that define us in peacetime. Consider again the Patriot Act, signed into law because of the fear we felt after September 11th, but which ultimately undermined the ideals at the heart of American democracy. Fear, as Americans felt in the early 2000s and as the spies felt in this week's Parsha, causes people to forget themselves and their values. As we meditate on the many possibilities before our country and how we feel about them, when we may not be certain of what to do next, we must focus on the things that we know to be true and the values that undergird them, about which we are absolutely certain. That wherever possible, diplomacy is the best way forward, that Israelis and Iranians, and of course also Palestinians, deserve to live in peace and dignity, that all of them deserve better leadership, and that further war is unlikely to yield a world in which any of us actually want to live. Lucy and Hazel, your Divrei Torah this morning were powerful teachings for navigating this moment because they directed us back to our values. that welcoming the stranger must come from a place of understanding and not a desire to control, that fear and doubt can cloud our judgment, and that trust, whether in God or in merely our values, must sometimes carry us forward. These teachings speak to this moment in American life just as they strike at the heart of Parshat Shlach. When the scouts returned from their reconnaissance, 10 of them came back with a report of danger, distorted by their own anxiety. Only Caleb and Joshua held fast to their convictions, urging the Israelites to continue, not because it was easy, but because it was right. According to tradition, their ability to be guided by their firmly held beliefs, even in spite of their fear, is why Caleb and Joshua were the only Israelite adults permitted to lead the people into the Promised Land after Moses dies. In this moment of uncertainty, may we, like Caleb and Joshua, find the courage to trust in a future shaped by principle, if not by panic. May we find the wisdom to push our leadership to do the same. And may this Shabbat offer us reminders of the deepest truths that we carry. Shabbat Shalom.